particularly the Asian community in the US, maybe and throughout all of the diaspora, we can just believe in ourselves a little more and we can be a little more unapologetic. And I think that's what I really hope that EST is a vessel for, is people feeling like they can be 100% themselves and feel really like hyped about that.
You're listening to Talk Doc to Me, a podcast dedicated to helping documentary filmmakers thrive. I'm your host and fellow filmmaker, Leah DeLeon, and today's guest is Keshia. Keshia Hannam is a writer, speaker, and documentary filmmaker based in New York. She currently serves as editor-in-chief for Eastern Standard Times, a global media company representing Asia and the Asian diaspora. Growing up mixed race and then living as an immigrant across Hong Kong, India, Australia, the UK, and now the US, Keshia was always drawn to how belonging and assimilation affect identity. Keshia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for saying my name so well. It's not an experience I have often, so it's lovely to hear you say it. Thank you for having me, Leah.
I am so excited. Well, today we're going to talk about your personal story, Eastern Standard Times, of course, and your top tips for how to find and manage talent across the globe. So I want to start first with your backstory. Can you explain to me all the different places that you've lived and then also how you feel like that's influenced your storytelling?
Oh, yes. This is my life. Here we go. So I was born in Hong Kong in 1991 when it was still under British rule. So technically it was a British colony. So I was born with British citizenship. My dad is from England. My mum is from India, from Bombay. And then I went to school in Australia. So the first few years of my life, actually, I didn't actually hang out with many kids. I was the daughter of a pilot and an air hostess. And so we traveled a lot. And I think I was just like always present at like dinner tables, having conversations about politics or finance or fashion or whatever it was, you know. So I think that was kind of where the first tendrils of loving conversation and being really curious about how people share information maybe started. And then I moved to Australia, which was complicated. It was, you know, I'm very grateful for Australia. It's a very, very beautiful country. It's a very clean country. It's very well run. There's a lot of social services for folks. It's actually a very diverse place, but it has a very homogenous culture. And so the sort of stereotype of being masculine, being very white with like a coastal edge, you know, very chilled or very hipster is sort of the dominant culture. And I really missed Hong Kong. And I don't think I realized that until my 20s and started going to therapy. I got therapy, shout out. And I just, you know, my reaction to that was just to assimilate. And so I spent, you know, 5 to 15 living between Australia most of the time. But then my dad was still flying for Cathay. So we would go and see him on school holidays. And my mum would teach us and, you know, fax through the curriculum through to my teachers for them to mark. And then I'd spend, you know, 3 months over the summer with my cousins in India. And then we would visit family and do trips around Europe from England. So I kind of really feel like all 4 of those cultures. I don't feel like when people ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from Hong Kong, but I really feel like I am equally all 4 of them. But again, I don't know if I realized that until I got into my 20s and started unpacking identity. And so that was sort of like my childhood. And I studied journalism and international business. I did a dual degree. And then I started working in media at 17. I started working for a radio station. And that was my first sort of foray into media. It was very cultural focused. And then I took on a assistant editor job at this very local magazine called Junkie that was all about like sustainability and reusing and super hippie.
What were some of, or maybe one story that you first worked on in these earlier years where you're like, wow, I think I could maybe make a career out of this?
You know, my main job at the radio station was that they would like send me out to interview people and they would like, it's called a cross. So they would cross to me from the radio station and I would be like interviewing somebody or like telling them about what was happening on like this tiny little coastal town. I'd be like, this big rugby team is playing and I'm interviewing the captain, so it was like not necessarily like breaking news, but in that town it kind of was. And I just found it thrilling. I thought it was so much fun to like drive out, set your little station up, pull people in, ask them questions, and then you would either be live or 5 minutes later you'd hear yourself on the radio. And I just thought it was so cool. And then like also the thrill of people coming up to me the next day at university, or like I was very involved in the church at that time, coming up to me at church and being like, oh my God, like I heard you on the radio, it's so cool, like this thing. And I was like, oh, people actually listen to this stuff. And like realizing like, I think at that age when you have a lot more ego and, you're very ambition focused to the idea that people are listening to you. But I think how that's translated is like the idea of this is how we share information, at the end of the day. That's why so many of us got into this, is like sharing stories and helping to have people access information and people they might not otherwise see. So that was
this
probably
podcast is your medium. You feel comfortable in this medium with the
Oh,
voice.
love it here. Yeah, this is my home.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so then you work at you doing radio, and
Yeah.
then what do you think was the next kind of milestone before Eastern Standard Times?
So I've had a very weird career in journalism. I'm definitely not a conventional journalist, and I feel quite insecure about it still because there's a lot of people who took a very conventional route, and I would say have like much more have a much more understandable CV and probably very trackable skills to that. Whereas I've sort of been working it out as I've gone. But I left Australia, moved to the UK, started working in insurance, and was like, oh, I'm just going to do my corporate girly era, and worked in insurance for a year. And I remember I finished a project and I was looking for other jobs to take in the company that I was working for, BLP. And my manager at the time, who was this very like demure, kind of like exactly who you would expect to work in insurance, pulled me aside and she said, Keshia, you've done a great job with this project. I'm not going to hire you again. You are too creative. You need to go do something else. You will die in this industry. And it was so funny
No
because I
way.
really was so impressionable at that time that I like listened to her. And I'm so glad I did, because I would have fully pursued a career in insurance of all things.
Does she know that you're doing this now? Have you
I
followed
don't
up with
think she
her?
does. And like, I don't even remember her name. Like,
Oh,
we
I was
really
gonna say you need
didn't.
to send her. You need to
I
send
do
her an
need to find
email.
her. You're totally correct. I totally need to find her and thank her for that, because it was one of the most life changing conversations of my whole life. But she was such a like enigma. She feels very much like she was also like a conduit to me at that time. People come to us to give us messages. So anyway, I moved back to Hong Kong. And when I moved back to Hong Kong, I started working in food media because I was obsessed with food and like the restaurant industry. And I'd worked in restaurants on and off while I was in university. So I was like, guys, I like have worked in restaurants. I think I can do this. And they offered me a job as like basically like an associate editor. Um, and that's how I learned the magazine industry. So I was writing for a magazine called Foodie, which was the biggest English-speaking food magazine in Asia at the time. And I, just learned how, everything from how to collect contributing writers and edit them to what a magazine structure is made up of. And I did that for 3 years. And in that,
What was like the best? Sorry, what was the best part of the magazine world, and what was like the worst part of the magazine world?
what's so crazy about being in like especially like magazines are very glamorous for a reason. Like you get sent stuff all the time to the office. We were always getting gifts and people would show up and do performances and we get free tickets to concerts. And so you're getting like it's a very, especially if you work for a cultural magazine, it's a very fun and glamorous life. I think that's also the worst part of it. Like it can be, you can sort of get numbed by the sparkling lights of it all. I don't think this is the case as much anymore, but back in the day, like 10 years ago, people were pretty mean to each other. And there was like a lot of cattiness, especially amongst, unfortunately, a lot of the women that worked there, because of the narratives we were all fed about who was going to get the story and who was going to get invited to the dinner and all of those kinds of things. So
That's real. Who gets invited to dinner? That can be catty.
and then you feel, if you don't get invited to dinner, then you feel like you failed and you feel like you're not good enough or cool enough. And, and there was
Yeah.
also in magazine fighting, like this, like the broadsheet in Hong Kong was called the SCMP, and they had an issue with, our boss at the time. And so they would write these smear articles. And it was just like, it was very, like gossip driven, and
Yeah.
it could have been a lot healthier.
Yeah.
But fortunately I was quite young, so like I didn't get too embroiled in anything. I also like kind of found it interesting, and
Yeah.
was able to sidestep it. And I think the other worst thing about it is, and this still remains today, the way that people engage with your stories. And this is also when like Facebook was the medium of choice for most publishers, and everybody was still trying to figure out their like social media strategy, and people just like ripped into you if they didn't agree with your point of view or your stance. And it was just like, it really affects you. But that's honestly where you learn to not read the comments, which is the golden rule of journalism. But that was kind of
Don't read the comments.
really where it started. So, I cut my teeth there. I ended up getting my name in a couple of publications like CNN and Fortune and Forbes and Nat Geo, and, slowly crawled my way up into higher publications. And then, honestly, Leah, I stepped away from the publishing world for about 5 years because I got really tired of pitching people. International media and local media is this very interesting dynamic where if you live in an Asian country, or this happens in Africa, this happens in Latin America, it's kind of all over the non-Western world, where the BBC or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Guardian, whomever, will set up a bureau, fly people from the US and the UK to those countries, and then they become the editors who decide the stories that run or don't. And they also determine the tone. And I got very tired of pitching stories that I knew were resonant to the community, whether it was about LGBTQIA rights or whether it was about like a local chicken breed that was like outstripping a French chicken breed, or whether it was about like an underground hip hop scene that was slowly becoming more and more mainstream. I would like pitch these stories, and people didn't want to hear about them. They wanted to hear about property, they wanted to hear about finance, and they wanted to hear about politics. And they wanted to hear about it in a really kind of like tense way. There was such a lack of representation of what we really were. It was so flat in terms of what we actually are and what we care about. So I stepped away from journalism and went into women's rights organizing, and co-founded a company with one of my best friends, and we did that for 5 years. And then I moved to the US, and in 2021, where I was doing speaking and a bunch of advocacy and things like that, I got a WhatsApp from one of my former mentors, Angie Lau, who was the lead of Bloomberg's Good Morning Asia. And she was like, you need to meet Eric and Jason. They're starting this media company that is all about bridging East and West. It's focused on young people. It's going to be cool, and it's also going to be meaningful. Like, you're the perfect person for it. And so I got put into this WhatsApp group, and then the rest is sort of history. They sent me the job description, and I felt severely underqualified for it, but I convinced them to give me 3 months to try and show them that we could do it. And we did it. And it's been 3 years.
Wow. Okay. So we're in the WhatsApp group. They're like, Keshia, you are the perfect person for this. What was the job description at this point?
So what's funny about it is that Angie Lau, my mentor, said that I was the perfect person for it because she knew who I was. Eric and Jason, Jason co-founded 88 Rising, and has gone on to do a number of other things in the sort of tech media culture space. And then Eric, who was formerly the only Asian exec at Vice, and then went on to do anonymous content, they had no idea who I was. So they were kind of like knew and had no idea who I was and what I had done in America. And honestly, I hadn't done that much. So when I say I was the perfect candidate, I think I was the perfect candidate spiritually and like from a personality perspective. But I had never run a media company before. I had never run a team of more than 5 people before. And I had never done multimedia journalism. I had only done written journalism. So I was a little bit of a wild card, and they definitely took a chance on me. And I'm so grateful they did. But the job description was like, it was like written to the managing editor at that time. And it was like, hey, managing editor, like, we're looking for somebody who can steer the ship. This person needs to understand the East as well as they understand the West. You need to be able to create content. You need to be able to manage really big teams, and you need to be able to like work under pressure. And I was like, oh, I can do all those things. I just don't have the specific skills. So let me be, I think this is always like what I've learned is that when you don't know something, you hire somebody who's better than you. And so hired our head of production, Stephanie Tankillison, who had just come from Vice as well, and then hired somebody who had just left CNN, Joy Jung, and then hired an amazing editor, Lynn, and eventually the team came together, and everything that I couldn't do, they certainly made up for. And then I was just there to help, make sure that the vision was executed.
Yeah, I love that. And thinking through that big life decision, as you're looking at this description, people are saying, oh, you'd be a perfect fit for this job. And just putting myself in the shoes of, an emerging storyteller of some sort that wants to, have their big opportunity, but maybe they're not sure which, route to take, or maybe they have an opportunity and they're like, like, I don't know if I'm qualified. I don't know if this is the right path for me. Or can you talk through maybe how you were able to come to the decision to accept it, and maybe some tips that you might have for someone who's in, not sure where to take their career path, but maybe this could be it. And maybe they feel underqualified like you did too.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I feel very like Jekyll and Hyde sometimes, which I'm sure we can all relate to in terms of having a very split personality where at times I feel incredibly confident and probably overconfident where I'm like, I can figure it out. Whatever it is, I can figure it out. And I usually have been able to figure it out, which is a lot of privilege, a lot of the access to education and networks, but also is just like actually being able to figure it out. And then the other half of me is like, I should never apply for any of these jobs. Like, look how smart these people are. Look how much experience they're looking for. I could never. And I think that with EST, like EST was such a special cocktail of requirements that I so uniquely fit, especially that east-west kind of bridge, that it was undeniable to me. And I remember so distinctly the moment of getting off the call with Eric, who's my now boss, and I was at Neuhaus in New York, and it was a rainy day. And I remember turning to my fiance and being like, I need to get this job. Like, this job feels like the whole like purpose of my being. And I'm so grateful that it worked out like that. I think I haven't always had that feeling about opportunities and positions. And I think that eventually you find that same kind of fit for purpose alignment.
And for people that have maybe never heard of Eastern Standard Times, can you explain who you are, your team, and basically like why you exist in as short as possible? I know we can go on and on about it.
Absolutely. For sure. So Eastern Standard Times, or EST, is a media company that was created to be the voice of the East. And very much in the way that I mentioned, why don't we have our own voice? We're at 50% of the world, but all of the major publications are UK and US based. And we think that's a remnant of a world that we've come from, but not the future we're heading into. And so we create short form content of many kinds, video, audio, and written. And all of it is focused on Asian topics, either in Asia itself or throughout the Asian diaspora.
Wonderful. And your role as editor-in-chief, for someone that maybe doesn't even understand what that means, like, what does editor-in-chief mean?
Totally. That would be so reasonable. Yeah, editor-in-chief even is like a little bit of a dated term. I think it's like what we brought from the publishing world, and it essentially, when it was used in magazines, it is the person who approves the final magazine copy and edit, or newspaper copy and edit. It's the person who decides the kind of sections that you have, and also sets an editorial standard. So that was essentially what we did at the beginning, and the version of that for EST was we were going to try really hard not to fly people anywhere, or we were going to try really hard not to send people who are not from that culture into that culture. So that kind of voyeurism, gonzo journalism that, Vice became really well known for, which we appreciate, and certainly like created a ceiling that we were able to then build our floor on, was so necessary at the time. And then the last part of that the editor-in-chief does is hire the team and decide who plays what role. And that's honestly been the biggest thing for me, because I've had the pleasure of working with such talented and creative people who have really they're the reason that EST is what it is.
Did you get any pushback, or do you feel like we're kind of on the future is brighter and people are accepting that, it does make sense for, a Thai film to have Thai filmmakers behind it? Or did you feel like there was pushback in the beginning?
I don't know that it was pushback because I think that nobody necessarily disagrees with that idea. I think what's difficult is that I still see, even today, the stories that go viral or do particularly well are still often like Western person goes to this place, reduces this story to a clickbaity headline, and then that becomes the documentary that goes viral. And that's still the norm for so much reporting and journalism. Social media has changed things dramatically. And in my opinion, there's obviously a huge amount that's bad about social media, but there's so much that's good. And I think we have to talk about that as well, that so many disenfranchised groups who didn't have access to the Al Jazeera's or the, even the news wires, the AP news wires or Reuters are able to tell their stories. Yeah, it's more of a frustration that I think we all need to value. And again, it's not to say that people cannot tell stories if they're not of that culture. But, even when the documentary that you and I worked on, we tried to make sure there was as much of a Filipino cast and crew there, given it was a Filipino story. And I think that as long as there's still intention to bring as much authenticity together, that's fine. I just think that often we send people in with a certain viewpoint, assuming that that's going to do well or that's what sells, and it reduces the subject to a trope or a stereotype.
Yeah, yeah. What is the process for EST in searching and curating stories? Like how does it start from an idea? Like does your team come up with the idea or do you get pitches? And then of course we can dive into like how do you actually find the people in Thailand, in San Diego, in New York, wherever?
Totally. So there's sort of two channels that stories come to us by. One is that people pitch us stories, and I would say that's like much more of the case now, now that we're 3 years old. But when we started, no one knew who we were, so no one was pitching us. At the beginning, what we would do, so as I said, we had a team of 22 people that were all around the world: Shanghai, Jakarta, Pakistan, Australia, the UK, the US. I created this very like manual spreadsheet on Excel where I had everybody blank out their name and put all of their stories. That everybody had to come up with 10 stories a month, or the like before the month started, and then we would all go in on and vote on the stories. So that means that for our production and editorial team, there was probably 12 people who were working on that full time. So that meant we had 120 stories each month. They had to have geographic diversity, diversity in terms of theme, diversity in terms of the subject, making sure that they were diverse in different terms of different abilities, different genders, different sexual orientations, different races, and then always made sure there was like some kind of like emotional tie-in that people could relate to, and then we would vote. And so it meant that I wasn't setting the stories, or the head of production wasn't setting the stories. It was whoever's story was democratically kind of elected,
Right.
which meant that so often like our most junior writers and junior producers were the ones whose stories were getting chosen because they were the most connected to culture and they were the most interested in telling an underrepresented story. So that was how we started, and from that we would whistle it down to however many stories we needed that month, usually between 6 and 12. And then we would go and produce those stories. And then from there, we had an amazing team of like our producers, mostly Stephanie, Joy, and Lynn, our senior producers. They had an incredible network from previous network experience, and myself as well. We would reach out to the folks we would know, and then we would eventually find somebody who was available as a freelancer, and then they would be the ones who would lead the project, and we would just help shape the story from wherever we were.
And for some people that might not have the stellar team that you have, maybe they're just by themselves, but they have, a documentary that they're working on in a different part of the world and they don't know how to get connected to that country or that type of community. What kind of tips do you have for people that are trying to find those filmmakers a part of those communities?
Totally. There's a lot of platforms now that exist. 10 years ago, these didn't exist and it was very much focused on your network. Whereas now there are so many platforms: Story Hunter, Video
I think
Consortium,
they're called Glimmer now.
Glimmer.
I think Story Hunter renamed themselves to Glimmer.
Fascinating. What?
Yeah. Side tangent.
Uh, do I love it? Not sure, but we'll go with it.
They are
um,
extremely low budget, okay? Like I was so surprised and I probably have an account on Glimmer and I have never gotten a gig from them in the last like 2 years. Like maybe this was now 4 years ago in the pandemic. And I was just appalled at the prices that they would give out.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
I only
I don't want to like
prices
name drop, but like they were expecting a lot for
a little.
$3,000. Like, I don't know, for like a whole thing. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. I mean, I've never been on the receiving end of it, so I'm sure that can be just like offensive. I always just put the like budget and the need
Mm,
out, and usually it was like a day rate and we needed somebody to go and, film this subject for a day. Um so it started, on those platforms, and then like I said, if you have people who are in a country, it's like really surprising how many people know somebody. And so for me, I've been fortunate to live in many different cities, and so it wasn't even that I like knew filmmakers in all of those cities. I just knew people who were involved in different creative communities, and
sure.
usually somebody knows somebody. And so I always say, like, if you're just starting to build your network, just let people know. And we would post constantly on our socials, and that would spread around, I'm looking for this person in this country. This is the job. This is the dates. Someone always kind of came along, and I think the world is so connected. And then the last place I would always look is Facebook groups. There's so many filmmakers and fixers and
They are not going anywhere.
they're not
Facebook
going
groups
anywhere. Yeah, yeah. The boomers might
are
have the
it.
feed, but we have the groups.
And what's funny is that I feel like I never post on Facebook. The other day I was just thinking like, wow, I should probably update my profile picture, or like,
There's like a brown girl Facebook group that's just about, filmmaking, and like there's so many little subgenres as well. So the internet is a very cool tool for that, to find people.
yeah. And over the last 3 years, what would you say was the most challenging part of scaling, pumping out a bunch of content, talking with people from all different backgrounds? Like what was the biggest challenge in your perspective?
I mean, there's been many. I think, a couple that come to mind as most prominent are, the stories you pick don't always do well. And I think that's always important to remember, is like, just because you're putting a lot of stories out doesn't mean they're all going to perform well. A lot of the time you're testing, so that's okay. But it's so disappointing to work really hard on something and then for like 4,000 people to see it. And you're like, that's it. So I think that's one of the things, is like tempering that, and tempering that team's disappointment, because, especially if you're more junior and you're not used to seeing stories do well or not do well, that can be a little bit more confidence knocking. And then I think the other thing that's always complex in terms of like working cross culturally is that people sometimes misunderstand the role of a publisher. Like, we had people that we were, doing documentary features on, so we're like showcasing them, their work, if they're collective, they're artists, whoever. And I think sometimes people think that we're a production company that they've hired, and like they have edits, or they, want to take this person out because they're no longer with the company, or like whatever. It's essentially like, thank you, can understand your concerns. Given this is a factual documentary piece, we are not necessarily taking edits. We wanted you to see it to make sure that there was nothing that was factually incorrect. But if there's anything stylistically you have edits on, we won't be taking those on this occasion. And
I
then,
hope everyone was taking notes. I'm glad we're recording this, because this is a hot topic.
We kind of landed in terms of whether you let people have edits or not. I think the world we live in, everything is very personal now, whether or not that's a good thing, that's just the truth. And so in the case where there is somebody's life story, or somebody is being particularly vulnerable with the things that they're sharing, I do tend to give them the courtesy of showing them the doc. I sort of let them see it, letting them know we're in final edit. And so unless something was really drastic and needed to change, we wouldn't be changing it, but we wanted to make sure that they felt happy with the overall product.
Like right around picture lock, like you're like about to lock it and you're like,
Correct.
okay.
I don't send any drafts, because also, as you know very well, and I'm sure folks know, if you're making any kind of docs, like, people, if you send them an early version, they freak out because they're like, ah! why am I gray? You know, like whatever.
All their insecurities come out. Just it's so natural. It's just like, why did you choose that shot? My arm looks fat. Like
Exactly. And also just like the magic of television hasn't worked its magic yet. So it's like, you know, that it's the animation isn't in, and like the archival isn't locked. So you still have like a big Getty images across, you know, there's just like so much stuff that makes it look kind of like unappealing. So I understand people freaking out. I usually try to send it at picture lock or just before picture lock. And then there's been times where I've sent it after we've finished. You know, we've done finishing, sound and color, everything's locked, and I've just sent to them being like, "Hey, we're releasing this next week, just to let you know this is what it is." And 96% of the time, it's great. There's 1% where someone's like, "Oh, that person isn't my mom, they're my aunt," so we have to go back and change that. And then there's been times where people have been like gotten into whole debates and spats, and we've just not posted the doc. So that's only happened.
the graveyard of unfinished docs.
So sad. Pour one out in a moment of silence.
What would you say are the key elements in a documentary that you are looking for that makes it a good story? As you're crafting with your team, the editorial team, like what are those little ingredients that you look for that make a good piece?
I love a plot twist. So always like when something goes in a different direction than you're expecting. I like a late reveal, meaning, and I guess that's also kind of like a plot twist, but I'm thinking of a doc we did where we were talking about a Chinese woman who's a carpenter, and she lives in Canada, and you're sort of getting this insight into her life, and then you learn she's queer kind of halfway through, and then you learn that that's like the reason she had to flee China. And I like, I think that just makes everything more interesting. I think we're still very much as a culture learning the show versus tell. And I still think that, and there's a place for that. Like social media is very good at doing the tell and doing it in a funny way. And I'm here for that too. But I think if we can remember like the tenets of storytelling, like there's an amazing, if y'all are familiar, there's a theory called Kurt Vonnegut's story arcs. And if you're not familiar, definitely look that up. But like just even those, give your stories a beginning, middle, and end, and make sure that they have some kind of structure. Like, is it that the subject, you met them and they were on a high, and then they lose something throughout the process of the documentary, and they think they're not going to recover, and then at the end they're able to bring themselves up and they're at a higher place than they were before. That's a very simple structure, but I think that often we just don't have that. And I think that that's like a really critical part to making a documentary interesting. So I'm very big on the story. I'm definitely not as strong on the cinematography and like sort of those more art house decisions, which is why I'm always really careful when I'm directing to have an amazing DP, yourself included, who is really good at that and is really good at catching that amazing B-roll or like knowing the days and the times of the day and the light and all those kinds of things. But I'm really huge on story, and I'm also really huge on making subjects feel safe. I love when you can tell the subject is like revealing things that they've maybe never said, and they're learning things about themselves in the process. You can see that in the end product. So I'm always kind of looking for that relationship that the subject has with the person who's eliciting that information.
That's always something that I try and think about. And the production can be so hectic sometimes. It can be like, what frame rate am I doing, or what is this, or what's the schedule, or who's calling me? But if you really focus on, at least in like the directing aspect of it, of like, okay, how can I just like make them feel comfortable? How can I make their best self like come out?
100%. I think that's so right. And I think like, yeah, psychological safety and, giving people, being able to receive someone's vulnerability as well. As a director, you're playing, interviewer, but you're also kind of playing therapist, and you're also kind of playing like distributor of fun, and like making sure the person, if they are saying things, I've had people say things and then freak out about the fact that they've said them as we're in like picture lock stage, or as we're finishing, or as we're in marketing and distribution. So like it's not a job that ends after you get out of the seat. It continues all the way through many months even after the film is released.
What big goals do you have for EST?
EST has so many different forms now. It's been so interesting that we created it as a publisher and created it to be a news platform, which it still is. But it's morphed into a number of different things. And as people have seen the relationship we have with the Asian community and the stories we tell and the way we tell stories, people come to us as like a production studio. So, I'm proud of the fact that we've been able to pivot and do a lot of brand stuff and also do a lot of network stuff. We're doing a lot of, my ideal for EST is that it would stay a publisher, it would continue to be a brand entity or like a brand studio, and then it will also be a community incubator where we can continue to either like host events and bring the community together, but also people can come to us when they're looking for connections or for a place to be able to share their experiences, or they just need help or a mentor or a friend. So that in terms of for what EST could be, I hope it remains both a hub of incredible storytelling, but also a place where the community feels represented, and also feels like aspirational. I think that particularly the Asian community in the US, maybe and throughout all of the diaspora, we like we can just believe in ourselves a little more and we can be a little more unapologetic. And I think that's what I really hope that EST is a vessel for, is people feeling like they can be 100% themselves and feel really like hyped about that.
I like that. Unapologetic. That's good. I like it. Okay, so for somebody that is looking to pitch you a story or be a part of what you're doing at EST, where do they go?
They can go to estmedia.com, which has our 3 different pillars, I guess, of our media company. They can email me directly, Keshia@estmedia.com. And then EST Media on all social platforms will lead you to our social handles, and they're welcome to, DM us. People, that happens to constantly. People DM us or they'll send us work that they've already done that they just want to have it showcased on EST. We're doing a lot more of that now, and in terms of going to existing directors and helping to spread their work a little more widely. So if you have an existing project, we want to hear about it. And if you have stories that you think need to be told, especially if you have the connection to the subject, then we really want to hear about that too.
And for doc filmmakers that don't gatekeep, what are your favorite like tools, apps, anything that you have benefited from, either as like editor-in-chief, either as like an organization of EST, or just you as a person? What are those things that you feel like people maybe don't know that you use all the time?
Yeah, Lucid is like a big game changer because exactly, we would be shipping hard drives across the world for, $120 each one. It's just like not feasible. What's crazy about it is that you can download the file directly onto your computer. So you can edit it and then directly upload it as though the folder was on your computer locally, but it's in a server. So it's just like such a good tool, and that's really been revolutionary. Obviously, all of like the media silos and like anything that allows us to review and leave comments. CapCut by TikTok is something we use a lot to trial different captions and see how they're going to work, as well as speeds, and see what like works best to optimize for social media. And then, all the ones that people are already probably using, like Canva is how we do all of our mock-ups for our thumbnails. I think that's all I can think of for the moment. That's pretty much the suite of what we use. Artlist is great for all of our royalty-free music. And then AI is becoming interesting. We don't use AI necessarily yet. We've used it for a couple of docs and we haven't been able to find archival. I'm open to using that. I think there's an ethical way to do that, which would be to go to existing photographers whose work you like and then license their pictures and then use their pictures as source imagery for AI to create something from, which is something that we've done before. I think that's one of the more ethical ways you can work with AI because everybody's getting paid as they should. But we'll see where this world takes us.
Love it. And I want to wrap out by saying you are also a speaker. So how, for someone that is thinking about, speaking or being part of being a thought leader in their space, like what kind of tips do you have for someone interested in speaking?
Start. So just like, begin. And I'm really bad at this online because I think I've been in the physical world for too long, and then the digital world, I'm very fortunate I have friends that like yourself or that I get to do some of this interfacing with online. But definitely just start by having conversations, posting it online, But also, so much of how I started doing speaking was very community driven and it was very local. And I would host nights, and speaking takes many different forms. Sometimes it's a panel, sometimes it's a keynote, sometimes it's a presentation, sometimes it's a workshop. But you need to have the experience to be able to keep building. So you just have to go out there and get them. So like host nights and invite 12 people, start there. Constantly pitch the people that you like. If you are a big fan of like the video consortium, like go to them, bring them an idea. Any of the big brands you like, hey, we do a lot of screening. I just did a screening for Google a couple weeks ago during AAPI month, and that was something that a friend had introduced us to one of the ERGs, employee resource groups, and they wanted to see our docs as soon as they heard about us, but they wouldn't have known about us if we hadn't gone and asked them if they were interested. So think about the brands you love, and reach out to their usually HR department and give them a really clear pitch. Give them a one pager, no more than one page, that has the title of the talk, what the 2 hours or 1.5 hour will consist of, who's going to be there, and why that you think it's beneficial. And you'll be surprised by how many people would be interested in doing that. Schools, universities, there's so many folks that want to have programming, and if you can bring it to them, it's going to have to be free initially. And I know some folks have feelings about that, but so much of what I've done that I'm now getting paid for, I spent years doing for free. And I think that honestly gives you the reps that you need to be able to do it well later down the track.
Get your reps in.
Get your reps in.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Keshia, for the time that we got to spend together. I think this is a fabulous episode. So I appreciate you giving all your insight to the listeners.
I love that you do this. Thank you for making this knowledge available to everybody. And anything I can do to help, I always got you. Thank you for being such a star.
That's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening and or watching. Please give us a rating. Tell us you love this podcast. Say hello. And we will see you next time.